This is the story of Ralph Swan, a local fighter, not dead yet but fighting for his life in the final 2 rounds. Opening facts of the crime. 2 masked individuals crashed through a plate glass door of the house. During the tussle and shooting, one of the intruders was shot in the chest or shoulder area. The one intruder shot and killed a man from an influential and powerful Delaware family. A red car was seen near the victim's house. There was one eyewitness, the victim's wife. The eyewitness says the 2 killers, after they had killed the husband and picked up all their bullet cases. Why and what did they want? Then the killers simply took a purse and nothing else before leaving. All of this was in November 1996. Then 3 years after the murder, police came and made arrest of Adam Norcross and Ralph Swan in the year 2000. Evidence from both sides. First, Ralph Swan's evidence of innocence, Prosecutor O'Neill and Gary's DNA expert Gina Pineda and her DNA results, which states that the male blood mixed in with the victim's blood on the victim's pants and his kitchen counter was not Swan's. Texas medical report from 1992 shows that Swan damage has left shoulder and a weightlifting accident. 3. Norcross recant. Says he lied about Swan being Norcross's accomplice and that Norcross' friend Wade was Norcross' accomplice. Gina Roberto's statement examined details show that a bruise on Swan's shoulder was 1997 and not 1996. Tina Halatanko's statement examined details show that the cut on Swan's shoulder was 1997, not 1996. Mike Stewart's original statement shows that Swan was boxing Mike Stewart in 1996 at the time of the murder at Tiberius Gym. Richard Edwards' statements are shown to be unreliable due to lies, bribes, mental illness and criminal history. Bridget Phillips' statements are shown to be unreliable to lies, bribes and benefits of a scorned lover. Matt Howell's statements are shown to be unreliable due to taking part in the murder, as well as other crimes he had committed with Norcross, hiding victims' stuff after the fight. Dr. A, month after the murder, saw no damage or injury on Swan's shoulder. 11 fight tapes a month after the murder show no injury or cut or hold on Swan's shoulder. Police evidence Tech Marble gave testimony stating that no prints or blood of Swan's were in the house or outside. Also, the video evidence given a black light in luminal test of the whole house. Prosecution witnesses stated that Norcross borrowed Swan's red car. Jack Murphy states that he never saw a cut on Swan's shoulder at his gym in 1996 and 1997. 15. Ralph Tucker stated that he and Swan went deer hunting a week after the murder, which was proven by the Wildlife Register, and there was no injury to Swan's shoulder. Police x-ray shows no bullet in Swan's shoulder. The boot print outside the victim's house did not match Swan's. New evidence, which has been submitted by Swan to Delaware federal judge Narica in 2021. Photo shows Swan 3 weeks after the murder in 1996 with no sling on the left arm and Swan holding his brother with his left arm. The victim's wife. Eyewitness told police that one of the intruders had blue eyes and the other had dark brown. Swan has greenish blue eyes. Norcross has blue eyes. Evidence used by corrupt prosecutor O'Neill, corrupt detective Brown, and corrupt trial judge Babiers to convict and kill Swan. Adam Norcross' confession at the 12 hours of interrogation states that Swan was Norcross's accomplice. Bridget Phillips stated that she overheard a conversation about a murder and later states that Swan told her that he was shot. Swan owned a red car. Gina Roberto stated that she saw a bruise on Swan's shoulder around the time of the murder. Tina Halatanko stated that she saw a cut on Swan's shoulder around the time of the murder. Matt Howell states that he saw gauze on Swan's shoulder around the time of the murder. Brian Snow states that he saw Swan's arm in the sling around the time of the murder. Proctor's notes states that some legal advice and says that Norcross should tell the police that Norcross lied if he confessed to something. Then Swan's grandmother's phone number was in the note. From the beginning, the year 2000, more and more overwhelming facts and evidence flowed into Detective Curtis Brown, Prosecutor Robert O'Neill, and Judge John Babiers, showing that Ralph Swan was innocent of the murder of Keith Warren. And furthermore, the statements and hearsay against Swan were lies and/or jokes created by Norcross, Norcross's wife Bridget, and Norcross's friend Matt, regarding Swan, for whatever personal reason, personal gain, or personal amusement. These people chose to lie about Swan. These are facts on record. Then these same lies by Norcross were adopted further, then twisted to seem like facts by Brown and O'Neill. My opinion on the matter: the start of things against Swan came about from Adam Norcross making up many stories, lies, and telling them to various people that Norcross knew, and upon arrest, eventually told versions of these conflicting stories, lies, to Delaware Detective Curtis Brown and to Narcos' lawyers. All these lies that Norcross talked about Swan were easily proven to be lies. These facts are on record. Norcross lies had bits of truth added to them so people might think that the whole story was true. Facts on record. Detective Brown and Prosecutor Robert O'Neill were on board with this style of lying because they themselves do this on a regular basis in their interviews and their interrogations. My opinion on the matter: one of the many examples of Norcross's lies that were proven to be a lie is that he told people that he was in the FBI. Other disgraceful lies were that he was in the Marines, Special Forces, and the police department. He stated that he went on missions in Iraq with Swan, where he or Swan was shot. The proven fact is Norcross was briefly in the Marines, but the rest of the story was a lie. The missions to Iraq being the Special Forces, Swan being with Norcross, and Swan being shot were all lies. Facts on record. One example that proves Detective Brown told lies and put Swan into those lies, just like Norcross did, was Brown on the witness stand admitted that he put a lie together to tell Norcross about Swan. Facts on record. A lie was also forged by Norcross about Swan, where Norcross stated to various people that a scar on Swan's left shoulder came from Swan being shot during the Warren murder. This lie was passed to Norcross's scorned ex-wife Bridget Phillips, and passed to Norcross's friend Matt Howell, and later passed the Detective Brown and Prosecutor O'Neill, then passed to a jury. Facts on record. But Detective Brown and Prosecutor O'Neill then came to learn through investigation and common sense that they were being lied to by these people regarding the scar on Swan's shoulder being the gunshot wound from the Warren murder. These are facts on record. Brown and O'Neill knew that Swan couldn't have been shot in the Warren murder right away, because 1. Brown and O'Neill dealt with guns, ammo, and the gunshot wounds on a regular basis throughout their careers as police officer and prosecutor. Brown himself carries and shoots with a .40 caliber pistol, which is the same kind of gun used to murder to kill Warren. There were mounds of evidence given to Brown and O'Neill showing that Swan had never been shot. These are facts on record. However, Brown and O'Neill forced Swan in chains to be x-rayed regardless of the facts and evidence of Swan not being shot. Facts, perhaps. Brown thought that given how tiny the scar was, maybe a .22 caliber gun had shot Swan at some point in time, and then maybe he could twist that information to fit into this crime somehow, because Brown knew that a scar as tiny as Swan's could not have possibly come from a .357 gun with hollow point bullets or a .40 caliber gun with hollow point bullets at close range, which were guns and ammo used in the murder of Warren. So why x-ray Swan then? Brown must have planned to make Norcross, Bridget, and Matt appear to be telling some version of the truth, at least, that a Swan was shot, so that the three didn't come off as total liars. But the thing is, Brown did not have a story that anyone was willing to talk about Swan being shot with a .22 around the time of the murder in 1996. My opinion on the matter: so there was this guy. His name was Joe Capra. The police used him to play as their bullet expert at trials. Capra was no bullet expert. He forged documents and lied about his credentials and education after he testified at Swan's trial to convict and kill Swan. Capra was found out and exposed for his fraud. Capra killed himself afterward. Facts on record. Maybe Brown was planning to get his fraud liar Capra to lie about the caliber of bullet in Swan's shoulder once Brown had removed it. Maybe to say that the .22 was a 40 calories or 357. Because why else would the seasoned Detective Brown get an x-ray on what amounts to speck on the tip of Swan's shoulder? Bone? A speck. Because Brown needed special cameras to magnify and manipulate Swan's scar for a jury someday to see. This bit is fact on record. At any rate, Brown's plan was ruined. Why? No bullet was found in Swan's shoulder by the X-ray, and an investigation showed that no doctor ever removed the bullet from Swan. Facts on record. Brown caught Norcross in many lies during interrogation. In one example, Brown asked Norcross if Swan was shot during the murder. Why then was none of Swan's blood found in the house or outside or on the way back to the car, as Norcross said? Norcross had no response. Facts on record. This particular lie about Swan being shot during the Warren murder should have been put to rest at this point, because now it was clear to Brown that he was dealing with a group of liars. Norcross, Bridget and Matt, out for personal gain and benefit, etc., which made them totally unreliable. But instead, Brown and O'Neill devised a plan to lie about Swan, claiming that the scar on Swan's shoulder is a bullet graze. That must have happened during Warren's murder. Facts on record. Thereby making it appear as though Norcross's scorned ex-wife and Norcross' ex-best friend are at least somewhat correct about Swan getting shot during the Warren murder. Brown and O'Neill would still be able to keep Swan as Norcross's accomplice instead of digging for Norcross's real accomplice, who was shot during the Warren murder and left blood behind. Otherwise, Brown and O'Neill would be facing more humiliation. 4-1. Locking up an innocent man and putting the death penalty on him. 2. Not finding the second killer again, after 3 years unsolved. This corrupt detective and corrupt prosecutor knew that their bullet gaze theory was a lie and they were going to put to a judge and jury. How do we know this? Because Delaware's own evidence. Technician Marvel tested the whole house with luminol and blacklight. Marvel then tested that one. None of Swan's blood was at the scene inside or out. 2. No black camouflage clothing fibers were at the scene from the intruders. Eyewitnesses said that the two intruders wore black or camouflage, all of which a bullet graze would have taken with it and placed it at the scene. How do we know this? Because the victim was shot with a .357 and a .40 hollow point bullets, and all of these things were placed at the scene. His blood enclosed the fiber. The victim was also bullet graze on the neck, truly destructive. Bloody and looks nothing close to what Brandon O'Neill claims Swan's tiny shoulder speck is. Facts on record. All of this is a large amount of evidence showing Swan's innocence versus shady hearsay. However, all of this is not the only things that told Brown O'Neill that Swan I was innocent. There was lots of evidence presented to Brown and O'Neill showing Swan's physical condition shortly after the murdering occurred. One bit of solid evidence was some films of Swan in kickboxing matches from Pennsylvania a month after the murder, in which Swan's shirt was off in the ring for 3 rounds, which was clearly visible to Brown and O'Neill that there were no bullet holes, no graze wound, no healing scab, or no purple bruise on Swan's shoulder. In addition, there were no range of motion problems. Facts on record. Another bit of evidence was that the fight doctor for those fights cleared Swan to fight that night after examining. This fight doctor testified that he would not have allowed Swan to fight if he had a healing injury or gunshot wound. Facts on record. Contributing to evidence of Swan's innocence in 1992 Texas doctor report that came with x-rays and showed that long before ever traveling to Delaware, Swan has sustained a shoulder injury in Texas. Are we to believe that by simple coincidence, the 1,992 injury is in the same exact spot that these people that include Brown and O'Neill say that Swan was shot during the murder in 1996? A red sports car was seen around the house where the murder occurred, and Swan owned a red sports car. However, Brown and O'Neill came to learn that the red Daytona was very often borrowed from Swan by Norcross. Brown and O'Neill learned this information from their own witnesses. Facts on record, but no evidence of Swan's innocence had mattered to Brown and O'Neill. Why? Political pressure was mounting for Brown and O'Neill after 3 years of not being able to solve such an important murder case. They needed to get and convict 2 people for the Warren murder, not just one person. After all of Brown's failures in the past 3 years suspecting wiretapping, innocent people being on Brown's mind, and with the highly influential Warren family, Senator Cook and their friends and local government angry and desperate for closure, it's no wonder why Brown and O'Neill were willing to do any terrible thing to pin the murder on Swan. It's sad to say, but who would care if Ralph Swan was innocent anyway, guilty by association? Swan was Norcross's friend, though not close friends at the time, because Swan had only just arrived in Delaware a couple months before meeting Norcross or the murder occurring. Another reason Brown and O'Neill didn't mind pinning the murder on Swan even though Swan wasn't Norcross's accomplice was that Swan was the ex-con on parole in Delaware from Texas. Swan was sent to prison for being an 18-year-old lookout boy for a robbery in Texas. To add to their existing factors, Swan was not wealthy or had a close-knit and influential family. So Brown, O'Neill and Judge Babiers didn't mind killing Swan with their death penalty. Now converted to life rotting to death, they must have viewed it as doing something terrible for a good cause. I suppose John Babiers. Brown and O'Neill disregarded any good thing that involved Swan, like Swan started his reform in Texas prison by signing up to get his GED and attained it. Swan has never been in trouble other than one conviction in Texas. Swan signed up for an apartment and building maintenance and completed it. Swan signed up for horticulture and completed it. Swan reconnected with his family and was allowed to parole to their care. Swan started a career in kickboxing. Swan made all his parole appointments for the whole 3 years. Swan's parole officer was calling Texas to get Swan off parole early. Swan gained employment and kept employment for 3 years. Swan enrolled in college and worked towards his associate degree in the field of sign language interpretation. Swan got engaged to an honest girl and took on her child as his own. Swan saved a couple people's lives in Delaware in the past from death. Swan in 3 years in Delaware was never charged with or suspected of any crimes. Swan donated to charitable organizations, facts on record. Swan never drank, smoked, or did drugs. Swan also taught kids self-defense, facts on record. The corruption, and at this point, attempted murder and underhanded deeds of O'Neill, Brown and others are soft-worded as misconduct, according to lawyers, or they call it miscarriage of justice or harmless errors. However, these characterizations are not straight and true. To describe the length that people of power and influence went to kill an innocent man for their own peace of mind and pleasure, Brown, O'Neill, and Babiers lied to people to kill Swan. Another example of this is prosecutor John Gary lied to his DNA expert Gina Pineda, telling her that there was a third suspect, intruder, when there never was. Gary was trying to get the DNA expert to change her DNA results, which would have exonerated Swan. Brown intimidated people to kill Swan. An example of this is that they stalked Tina Holotanko at her work and at her home, accusing her and demanding she give them more information about Swan. It was to the point that Tina Holotanko had a mental and physical breakdown and needed doctors and lawyers to help her against Brown terrorizing her any further, which still did not stop them. Facts on record. Another well-lit example of intimidation of witnesses to kill Swan is when Brown and O'Neill went to Mike Stewart's job and his home to intimidate Stewart into changing his written and then sworn statement that Stewart had just given on the witness stand. Stewart had testified that Swan was at the gym boxing with him at the time of the murder for the purpose of sparring to prepare for Stewart's upcoming fight. He had corroborating evidence as well. Facts on record. No one would have known these facts as Stewart had not gone into another room and called Swan's lawyer, Dave Jones, to beg him for help, and tell Jones in that conversation that Brown and O'Neill were trying to make Stewart change his sworn testimony, which would make him commit perjury. Brown and O'Neill committed fraud to kill Swan. One example of this is when they hired Joe Coppola to be /play as a bullet expert, but Coppola was not one. He was a fraud. After Swan was convicted with Coppola's testimony and credentials, which was believed by a jury, the trial ended and Swan was put on death row awaiting execution. Coppola was exposed as the fraud and liar he was. Then Coppola killed himself. Facts on record. Another example of Brown and O'Neill committing fraud to kill Swan is when they put fraud and liar Richard Edwards on the witness stand, knowing all the while that Edwards would lie to a judge and jury and prepping him to do so before taking the stand. Brown and O'Neill bribed people to kill Swan. One example of this is that they bribed a mentally ill, liar and criminal drug addict Richard Edwards with better prison conditions and early release from prison if Edwards would lie under oath for them about Swan. Also, Edwards lied about his own criminal offenses and lied about Swan for benefit, stating that Swan gave him a note. Brown and O'Neill had the note, Proctor note, tested before Edwards ever testified. The Proctor note did not have Swan's fingerprints nor was his DNA on it, which proves that Swan did not give Edwards the note. One example of this is when O'Neill and Brown threatened to take Tina Holotanko's little girl and throw Tina Holotanko in jail if she didn't give them something more to use against Swan, which she didn't have and was proven when she was forced to take a lie detector test and passed. Brown and O'Neill tampered with witnesses to kill Swan. One example of this is when the second prosecutor, John Gary, at O'Neill's instruction called the prosecution's DNA expert Gina Pineda. Gary mentioned that there was a third intruder, knowing that that information was false. Then Gary called Dave Jones and added more deception to the case by having Jones lie to a judge, stating that Gina Pineda changed her DNA results, and she wouldn't be testifying now. Years later, Gina Pineda testified that she never changed the results of the DNA, which essentially exonerated Swan. Brown and O'Neill hid half of the DNA results from Swan's lawyer. Gina Pineda's DNA results came from 2 bloodstains, one mixed in with the victim's blood found on the victim's pants and the other on the victim's kitchen counter. Both stains were from Norcross's accomplice. The blood did not belong to the victim or any of the victims' families, Norcross and most importantly Swan. Deductively, we can only arrive at the conclusion that the blood had belonged to Norcross's accomplice. The vast amount of lies, intimidation, fraud, bribes, threats, evidence tampering, witness tampering and coercion that Brown and O'Neill and Gary engaged in to get a conviction on Swan for murder which they knew he did not commit is utterly horrible and the epitome of unjust. Brown and O'Neill questioned Matt Howell, Tim, Gina Ruberto, Debbie Raffel, Brain Snow, Norcross, and Bridget Phillips off tape, then taped favorable interviews so that Brown and O'Neill could steer statements and moments in these people's lies and their plans against Swan when it sounded like Brown and O'Neill could twist it to fit evidence in the murder or make it look like it was around the time of the murder, which wouldn't be too difficult to do, given that Swan was friends with one of the murderers, Norcross, at the time of the murder. Also, Swan let Norcross borrow his car which was used in the murder. Asterisk Brown and O'Neill used these people's fear of police and jail and their ingrained wish to help good police officers aren't good prosecutors. Brown and O'Neill also used the greed and hate of some of these people to get them to say whatever is necessary to get Swan convicted. Brown and O'Neill questioned Matt Howell, Tim, Gina Ruberto, Debbie Raffel, Brain Snow, Norcross, and Bridget Phillips off tape, then taped favorable interviews so that Brown and O'Neill could steer statements and moments in these people's lives and their plans against Swan when it sounded like Brown and O'Neill could twist it to fit evidence in the murder or make it look like it was around the time of the murder, which wouldn't be too difficult to do, given that Swan was friends with one of the murderers, Norcross, at the time of the murder. Also, Swan let Norcross borrow his car which was used in the murder. Brown and O'Neill used these people's fear of police and jail and their ingrained wish to help good police officers aren't good prosecutors. Brown and O'Neill also used the greed and hate of some of these people to get them to say whatever is necessary to get Swan convicted. Brown and O'Neill put these people at various times in the interrogation in a room and left them alone, with the statements of all the other witnesses and suspects open all around the room for these people to read. Facts on record. No doubt, this tactic was to tamper with and influence witnesses for what was expected of them to say when Brown and O'Neill returned, which makes it a lot easier to steer these people to what needs to be said and how to say it. Detective Brown and Prosecutor O'Neill went to classes to learn how to become professionals at this type of manipulative and tampering tactics. Examples: leading questions and open-ended statements ECT. My opinion and supported with facts. Matt Howell refused to tell Brown anything about Matt's friend Norcross at first or the murder. Facts on record. This would mean that Brown employed tactics of fear, threats, intimidation and bribes to get Matt to turn on his friend Norcross and give Brown some information or stories to use. Brown probably used incentives offered to Matt like promises of his freedom and returning to his family and life and job. Brown probably also promised Matt immunity from prosecution for anything Matt might have done in the murder. Of course, this would be because Brown just wanted Swan for the murder. So only then did Matt come up with a story about Swan and gauze and locker room at work. Brown probably helped Matt with this lie given that no one in the factory mentioned seeing this on Swan in the locker room at any time, and Matt never told this story to a single person in all those 3 years. Or maybe just Matt and Norcross came up with this story in anticipation of arrest. At any rate, Matt never told the police, never told his wife, never told his group of friends or any of his family. No one corroborates this story of Matt's or the one about robbing drug dealers conversation that Swan was put in. Facts on record, anyway. So Matt suddenly had no fear of going to prison and starts telling Brown at least some of his role in the murder. Facts on record. Brown and O'Neill could have just as easily charged and convicted Matt Howell of the Warren murder and being Norcross's accomplice rather than Swan. In fact, Brown and O'Neill had more to go on with Matt. For example, Matt admitted to getting rid of the murder evidence with Norcross after the murder. So only then did Matt come up with a story about Swan and gauze and locker room at work. Brown probably helped Matt with this lie, given that no one in the factory mentioned seeing this on Swan in the locker room at any time, and Matt never told this story to a single person in all those 3 years. Or maybe just Matt and Norcross came up with this story in anticipation of arrest. At any rate, Matt never told the police, never told his wife, never told his group of friends or any of his family. No one corroborates the story of Matt's or the one about robbing drug dealers conversation that Swan was put in. Facts on record, anyway. So Matt suddenly had no fear of going to prison and starts telling Brown at least some of his role in the murder. Facts on record, Brown and O'Neill could have just as easily charged and convicted Matt Howell of the Warren murder and been Norcross's accomplice rather than Swan. In fact, Brown and O'Neill had more to go on with Matt. For example, Matt admitted to getting rid of the murder evidence with Norcross after the murder. Fact on record. Fact on record, Matt and Norcross buried murder evidence at their concrete workstation together. Fact on record. Matt talked to Norcross about robbing drug dealers. Fact on record. More evidence was found from the murder on Matt and Norcross outside of the factory that they worked at. Fact on record. Matt and Norcross had already robbed the concrete company together that they worked for. Fact on record. Matt and Norcross were close friends a year or more before Swan ever came to Delaware. Fact on record. The only alibi Matt had was one guy. Fact on record, Brown and O'Neill could have just as easily made that alibi for Matt change his statement like they did to Swan's alibi, Mike Stewart. With Tina Halatanko and Gina Ruberto, Brown and O'Neill confused these girls about the actual time of a shoulder injury of Swan's, talking them into thinking and saying that the injury to Swan was around the time of the murder. My opinion on the matter, Brown and O'Neill ignored the actual evidence and details from these girls that proved that the various cuts, bruises or scars on Swan's shoulders were long after the Warren murder, into the middle of the year after, or years before Swan ever came to Delaware from Texas. One detail from Brown and O'Neill's own witness, Gina Ruberto, that Brown and O'Neill disregarded was when Gina stated that she saw a bruise on Swan's shoulder at Big Kahuna nightclub sometime around the murder, and that Swan had a tank top on. Well, then this shows that it was in the summer of 1997 and not November 1996, which the on-scene officer the night of the murder stated that the weather was bitter cold. Facts on record.